Edith Medford trying to get it anymore, widow. Then you
So basically, with this new variant, this vaccine gonna cover that thing?
hardest hit communities, the fewest vaccinations. Black and Latino Americans are nearly
See, you go with the race thing again. Come on, Cynthia.
and recent
No, it's
data
not.
from
It's about the
Census
same.
reveals blacks are often 2 to 3 times less likely to be
See, you see how they focus on that? Now, there's people dying. Why are they worried about the race of people dying?
So where do they go? And the answer in many cases is there's nowhere to go.
And sources tell ABC News the government is considering calling on up to 10,000 service members
Hello.
to administer shots. And
Finally got my camera working.
sites around the country. Rita Roy, ABC News, New York.
Want to do a video.
Finally rescued after being stranded in the snow for days. A booster bond
Commenting on the
and
news everyone checking out.
died trying to live on
Uh,
the planet and everything beyond.
I wanted to make a video, another video, and this is time. This is decided to go a direction of. I'm going to show you this one. It's called the 151 Sources of Understanding Racism. This is from the Smithsonian Magazine. As you go down, it's a short, talks about the history of the Smithsonian. But this goes in, when I mention ancient hatred, when it comes to African Americans, there's an ancient hatred that stretches back all the way to 1500. And here it is. In 1525 through 1886, 12.5 million people were kidnapped from Africa and sent into the Americas through the transatlantic slave. Only 10.7 million survived the harrowing 2-month journey. Comprehend the sheer scale of this forced migration. The slavery's subsequent spread across the country. While regional trade can be daunting task, but as historian Leslie Mears told the Smithsonian Amy Crawford earlier this year, framing these big concepts in terms of individual lives, and it can help you better understand these things mean. Okay, we're gonna go down through this. This is what they were trained in. They actually had people that were chained during slavery from the west coast of Africa. You probably seen pictures of this. Okay, we're gonna take the instance, the story of John Kasser. Originally indentured servant of African descent, Kasser lost a 1654 or 1655 court case intervened to determine his contract had lapsed. He became the first individual declared a slave for a life in the United States. Manuel Vandu, a Yoruba man, was captured and sold to traders in some 200 years after Kasser's enslavement. Later shared an account of his life while the British Foreign Anti-Slavery Society document a remarkable story of a decade enslavement in Cuba. He purchased a share of a lottery ticket and won enough money to buy his freedom. In records now and available, the digital-based freedom narratives, similarly to its document based on online sources, and provides individual describe fugitive slave as historian Joshua Rothman describes as sort of a little biography. Finally, the life a little life biography will provide insights on this subject. Okay, he's from 16, so this is the 15 to 1600s. We move up to 1800s. Finally, the case of the life of Matilda McKillary, the last known survivor was a transatlantic slave. This is the last known person doing kidnapped from West Africa, brought back to the U.S. on this word. She arrived in Mobile, Alabama in 1860, more than 50 years after the Congress outlawed the import of slave labor. McCreary died in 1940 at the age of 80 or 81 or 82. This spleen defined streak in her latter life, wrote Bridget Katz. Early this year, she refused to use her former owner's last name. She wore her hair in traditional Yoruba style. And had a decade-long relationship with a German white man. This is the woman that she was the last slave. In 1940, she died. But this from 1890 all the way up to 1940. Then we go from further into the 1850s. These were people on the plantation, a cotton plantation. When we showed out the cotton for the 1860s. This was in the museum. Slavery town. Here's a town. This was a slave market in Atlanta, Georgia, back then. In 1865. We're going to play this video.
This is Side Door, a podcast from the Smithsonian with support from PRX. I'm Halima Shah. When I was a kid, a lot of my summers were spent in the backyard and around the neighborhood's cul-de-sacs. We had a lot of space to do our thing, even by the standards of suburban Chicago. And I kind of credit that freedom for all the fun that my neighborhood friends and I used to have as kids. Because we caught fireflies, we dug up worms, played Foursquare, and chased some very aggressive geese on our bikes. But no geese were harmed in this process. Those moments from my childhood seemed unimportant to me at the time. It was just what we did. But when I take a second to really sit with those memories, I think they tell a much deeper story about my family and who I am. I recently heard a woman named Laverne Magid talk with the Smithsonian about her childhood. Let me tell you, hers was nothing like mine, but I wonder if she has similar feelings. Maybe a little nostalgia when she looks back on a part of her life that's nothing like today. Laverne grew up at Edisto Island, South Carolina in the 1960s, and every Sunday she visited her grandmother's 100-year-old cabin, which was also on the island.
We played, we eat, and we had fun because all we knew we was going to Mama's house, and we could run wild when we go to Mama's house because we was outside in this big yard.
Laverne and her sister Marvette shared those memories with the Smithsonian as part of an oral history project.
We didn't have anything, so we made everything we played with. We used to play baseball. And we had a can for our ball and a stick for our bat, and we would stand on the porch and wait for whoever to get out. So the porch was like our dugout. So that's what I remember most.
But what if you found out that your childhood refuge, and well, baseball dugout, was something that the Smithsonian had been looking for? That's what happened to the Magid sisters. The home that their grandmother and relatives even before her were born in is now a centerpiece of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. So what's so special about a simple wood plank cabin that has housed generations of the maggots up until 1981. This time on Side Door, we'll find out. Can't get enough of Side Door? Well, there's more. Sign up for the Side Door newsletter to get behind-the-scenes content for each episode. There's so much more to our stories than we can fit into each episode. The newsletter is where Side Door producer Justin O'Neill and I can share photos, videos, facts, and favorite moments that, for whatever reason, didn't make it into the podcast. You can also find links to articles and more specifics about the research being done here at the Smithsonian, across the country, and beyond. Sign up at si.edu/sidedoor. That's si.edu/sidedoor. The National Museum of African American History and Culture opened in 2016. To make your way into one of their most moving exhibitions, the Slavery and Freedom exhibition, you have to take an elevator 80 feet down.
So we're going to take the elevator down, and when you get on the elevator, you'll see that we go back in time. So
As you descend 2 stories, the year goes from 2018 to 1400. And you just heard from Mary Elliott speaking a second ago. She's the best person to go on this journey with because she co-curated the exhibition, was on the team that went searching for the cabin, and has been working with the museum since way before it opened.
years, we tell the harsh reality of the nation's history. But that comes with 2 things. There's human suffering and there's the power of the human spirit. And that power of the human spirit includes resistance, resilience, and survival.
And so if you go to see the cabin in person today, you walk through over 400 years of racial injustice in America.
And you see, we start with the story of Africa and Europe, which leads us into the development of the transatlantic slave trade.
And just as much as this is a story about a cabin, it's also the story of our country. The cabin represents a moment in the museum that sits directly in between the darkness of human suffering and the promise of freedom. It's a crucial bit of real estate in a museum that documents some of history's most sinister chapters and also celebrates some really powerful moments.
And now we're in colonial North America, which allows us to talk about, again, that shift aid and the impact of the people coming into North America. And that is broken out by region. Chesapeake, Low Country, South Carolina, Louisiana, the North, and then we connect the story of North America to the transatlantic slave trade itself.
Okay, I realized that when we started talking about the cabin, we introduced it as a place for idyllic childhood moments. But Mary Elliott reminds us that telling a story about this cabin means talking about what built it: slavery. And
The story of slavery is about a system of profit and power, and the people who were exploited by it.
So much of
II was 9 years old. Building sandcastle during a trip. Julian was the Brown Roosevelt desegregation public schools. National aggressive government spending aim to leveling the playing field. Mention to make it through Congress. Wow. Earlier this week, Sam Paul was up in Senate in initiatives. Bro. For equal justice into the opening the first monument of African American lynching. This anchor website standalone statement dedication Pearl, Massachusetts, or something like that, Louisiana. I can't spell the name. In September 1868, 2 months ahead of the presidential election, Southern Democrats, look at this, Southern white started tearing Republicans who appeared to poised to during the poll. American students, he published an account of local Democrats' intimidation of Republicans. Bentley escaped with his life, but 27 of the 29 African Americans who arrived at the scene helped him with the similarly executed over the next 2 weeks. The vigilant I'm sorry, my computer screened out. Terror led to the deaths of 250 people, the majority of whom were black. So there were black people that were terrorized. This is a history. And what you see in Washington, what you see, this is American history. It's the same spirit that goes on and on. In April 1873, a spat of violence in Rock, Louisiana, called the Colfax. This was another racial carnage. In 1873, in deaths of between 60 to 150 African Americans, as well as 3 white men. During the turn of the 20th century, in the 1920s, multiple massacres broke out in response to false allegations that the young black men had raped, otherwise assaulted white women. In August of 1908, a mob terrorized African Americans' neighborhood across Springfield, Illinois, vandalizing black businesses, setting fire of homes, black residents, beating those unable to flee, lynching at least 2 people. Authority argues historian Robert. And this is the Black Wall Street. You probably heard of this one. The 1921, where 40 black neighborhoods were demolished. They bombed the youth to bomb these black neighborhoods. See, this racial tension goes all the way back. Okay, false accusation will spark the 1919 race riot in Washington, D.C. in Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921, which is mostly dramatized in HBO Watchmen and African American History Museum curator Paul Culiolio tells certain tensions at the Tulsa, Oklahoma. See, oh shit, sorry about that. See, this racial stuff is going into the 1920s, and it confront. Here's another play with East St. Louis Ward, 1970, the labor dispute turned deadly. This was a racial war. From there, even on to the murder of 55-year-old Knight Emmett Till, accused of whistling at a white woman while visiting family members in Mississippi. He was kidnapped, tortured, and killed. His mother, Mamie Tay Mobley, decided to give her son an open casket. And you probably remember this one. This is Emmett Till's mother. He allegedly, and the woman who still to this day lives, the one accusing her boy, this woman's son, and reported. See, it goes on in the late 20s in Cook County, South Africa, with 5% of the area's population, the victims of police killings, civil rights, African Americans. This is what happened to African Americans from century after century after century after century. This is what it is. This racial things. This is a part of America they don't want you to know about. This is what happened.
when it's simply the color of their skin and false accusation that black men were raping white women. So they would cause all these things from the 1800s all the way up to now. It goes on from the Creole Rebellion from 1841, enslaved African Americans. The Creole
This is an ancient hatred towards African American people. Has not had been in these people which in African American time was trying to live and work and prosper. But every time they do, there was jealousy, envious, and hate. They had to find some way to literally just murder somebody. Murder them for no apparent reason, no justification. They didn't commit no crime that none of the African Americans could commit no more cause them to murder. But they did it anyway. Time after time. This is the reason why. How come black people can't get together? Look, this is your answer right here. Because this is going on from decade after century. 430, going back over 400 years. And still to this day, in the 60s, and then move into the 70s, the late 60s. The late 60s was really bad. Talks about the Detroit riots. It talks about the inequality of black sanitation workers. It talks about this stuff. Wow. So you see, this is what happened. And if you were white and you stood with the blacks, you were murdered too. Get your house firebombed too for doing the right thing. And so here we have it today. It rose over time. And now we're in the 2020. It rose.
Now they put other things in the sexuality in there. Now other groups have come in on it, like LGBT rights, but in feminism and transgender rights. This is where it gets really, the feminist talks about the feminist movement. But before all that, I visited this one. This was a nice museum to go. I recommend you go visit. It's really eye-opening. Go visit that. It's really something to see. It's beautiful on the inside. I'm gonna play the short video. Not too much.
You guys hear me okay? You guys hear me okay? Alright. I really can't make out many faces, so thank you all for being here. And thank you especially to Steve and Yusuf for putting this together. Let me get things sorted. So this will be a long talk, I have to be honest, okay? But we have a lot to cover, and we got to get everybody on the same plane, roughly. All right? And I want to be completely honest from the outset. I think the way that the term race gets used today is profoundly euphemistic. You see, when I hear the terms like race and privilege and inclusion, I admittedly cringe a little. And the reason is not because I'm afraid to engage these terms. I engage them literally every day, but because I'm convinced that what we really want to talk about is racism and power. And it seems so hard to make this simple rhetorical move in U.S. society is unbelievably telling. This evasion speaks volumes, I would say, to the ways in which racism has been working in U.S. society since the 1970s and early 1980s, really. As I'll get to later, the collective evasion about racism works hand in hand with the way power works in the U.S. in the 21st century. And I think this is why activists have appropriated the term white supremacy today. This language is meant to rattle those who see racism as a problem of personal moral failings, as a problem reducible simply to personal belief and attitude, and as problems that do not affect all of us, but only some of us. This movement we call Black Lives Matter is about calling this myth into question. Indeed, I would say that it's as much a response to the failings of late 20th and early 21st century race talk as it is a product of it. You see, over the past 30 years or so, thinkers and activists committed to justice have found themselves in the tricky place of having to talk about race and privilege rather than racism. This is not simply because we find ourselves having to cater to so-called white anxiety, but also because in today's marketplace of ideas, these euphemisms have a commodity value that is disproportionate to their transformative value. But as a historian, you see, I'm principally concerned with this tricky thing we call causality. And this evasion, this shifting of our attention away from racism and toward race, it does a certain kind of work. This is because race does not explain causality. Racism does. So let me start with some definitions here. Race is the child of racism, not the parent. Racism is a social practice and thus an action. And actions take place over time and are committed by individuals and groups of individuals. Ultimately, racism seeks to make race real. It seeks to make natural inequality seem true. On the other hand, race is an ideology. Race is a collective faith that intrinsic differences distinguish humans into distinct groups of unequal rank. So let me repeat that. Race is a collective faith that intrinsic differences distinguish humans into distinct groups of unequal rank. The ideology of race sanctions inequality as natural and unavoidable. Racism can exist without the ideology of race, but over time and in the right setting, racism gives the ideology of race life. So how so? Racism works through daily practice, through daily rituals and communicative acts that make race seem like something observable and supposedly verifiable. Today, this works despite the fact that we know there is nothing scientific about it. There are no ways to distinguish between human races with DNA because race does not exist. We know this, it's a hard fact, we know it, period, okay? So another thing to consider is that racism aims to give race causal power. Thus, from the most violent white nationalist to the most sympathetic and heartfelt progressive, everyday discourse frequently serves to keep race real, and such that we see it, we feel it, and we experience it. Black folks do X, whites do Y, biracial people think Z. How many times have we heard those statements? Such shorthand reductions help us rationalize history's phantasms and cling to them for security because we can't know anything else. The ideology of race is so deeply entrenched in U.S. society that even when people on opposite ends of the political spectrum join hands in celebration and declare their commitment to so-called colorblindness, racism continues to work in our society. Saying that we do not see race does not mean the ideology of race disappears. Understanding and combating racism does. This brings me to a very, very important point. Racism, as an action, concerns ascribing difference, and this point is critical. The everyday practice of racism involves identifying others as part of a coherent group defined by supposed inherent traits, and ranking this other group in society according to some standard of equality. Now, racism can be practiced by anyone, but for racism to become widespread and for race to operate as an ideology, for that notion of inherent difference to actually do the work of ordering and ranking society, there must be a disproportionate distribution of power over said society's political economy, including this group could
identity in the face of encounter. In other words, both identity and identification are informed by power, but they are not the same thing. Racism works principally through identification, by identifying hierarchies and making them seem natural, and this is what I'm going to focus on today. Institutionalizing these hierarchies requires an unequal distribution of power that is vigilantly guarded and defended every day. Thus, racist discourse needs a critical mass of participation to organize society and to institutionalize inequality. Race ideology preserves this inequality and reproduces it by constituting markers of difference as markers of hierarchy. Race is the child of racism, not the parent. Racism aims to institutionalize inequality. Racism aims to make race real. Race ideology demands that this inequality is natural and fixed, and thus nothing can be done to change it. I need to say one more thing before getting to the history. One important function of race ideology is that it demands that races are perceived as timeless. This is a move that masks the changing patterns and historical disjunctions of racism, a move that serves to deny the agency and power behind the acts of identification. Okay? So let us get to some history. So as I see my task today, it's to shift our perspective of issues of power and the ways in which it relates to changing patterns of racism in the United States over time. We have to explore how groups have used race as a way to rank and order society and why. Now, this is a huge task and requires some dramatic abbreviations. So for our purposes today, we can really think about the changing face of racism in 3 periods, or what I'll call X. The key issue I want to get across is how the practice of racism has been remade again and again. With each moment, we see breakdown and reconstitution of power along new definitions of equality. So what is crucial to consider is how the transformation of one institution to the next involved profound changes to the workings of racism. With each shift came a new social theater within which racism would morph and change, fostering in turn new ways to normalize hierarchy and naturalize inequality to benefit some over others. The first phase I want to review we'll call empire. So I want to begin here with this rather famous image by William Blake. to start here because I want us to think of this not really as our starting point, but really as a turning point. This image captures something very unique about late 18th century thinking. Here we see how Blake uses the stylized image of the female body, fecund, shapely, ripe for productivity, to capture the dependence of Europe upon her colonial bodies of America and Africa. America, represented with reddish-brown skin and silky, long, dark hair stands to the right of white and bright Europe, holding her up at ribs and back. Africa, represented in dark brown tones with short, tight curls, stands to the left of Europe, embracing her from behind while supporting her with grasped palms affront. We see all three figures linked together with this long, verdant rope, a representation of the ties that bound Europe to the colonial Atlantic world, a symbol of the unifying wealth born by supporting the role of Europe's colonial bodies. I want to begin here with this image because it reveals a very modern kind of racial taxonomy. Not only does it signify the emerging and powerful role tropes of sympathy and inclusion would come to play in the history of racism, but also in its most basic sense, it serves as a window into what had become a very real and powerfully modern ideology of race. Here we see Europe, Africa, and America in ways that are likely very resonant with our own thinking today. Skin, eye, and hair color, as well as hair texture, signify separate groups of people, African or black, European or white, and perhaps the most confusing for us in the United States, American as Indian. Place and role, too, bear significantly upon the image. This thinking itself was really a child of empire. Race is the child of racism, not the parent. This very image of race, of difference embodied according to phenotype, was in fact very new when we consider the grand scale of human history. When we look at Blake's image, pay close attention to the arms of Africa and America. Here we see how Blake, in an effort to provoke subtle discussion about the relationship between equality and race, signifies the history of enslavement by way of the gold armbands wrapping around the supportive arms of both darker-skinned women. Now, the connection between racism and slavery is long-standing, yet I must explain that Blake's image was the product of a very distinct kind of slavery, plantation slavery. Now, slavery as a social practice is ancient. The institution of plantation slavery, however, is relatively new. It was the plantation, above all else, that gave credence to the notion that society could be organized according to the triptych, distinct hierarchies represented in Blake's image. Prior to the rise of the Atlantic plantation complex, legal sanctions for slavery were based on religious law. Skin color, the key ascriptive category of modern racial thinking, was not cited as a justification for slavery in the Mediterranean. Indeed, we know that the term slave itself is derived from the ancient Greek word Slav, an ethnonym used to identify those of present-day Eastern Europe who were viewed as particularly ripe for enslavement in the Greek world. Now, in the Middle Ages, Catholic decree and Islamic law maintained that enslavement can only be reserved for social outsiders who refused conversion after being captured in war. Fellow Catholics and Muslims could not be enslaved. Religion, not skin color, determined enslavability. Now, this is not to say that we don't find prejudicial references to dark skin in the writings of scribes and ecclesiastics, whether they be Catholic, Muslim, or Hebrew. But in the context of Christendom and the Islamic caliphates that dominated the Mediterranean, these discourses did not by any means structure the hierarchy of society. Modern racial ideologies simply did not exist. Hence, throughout the Mediterranean world in the Middle Ages, we find that people who we would describe as white, black, or Arab today were sold side by side and often forced to labor together. Now, this historical fact is important for understanding why the figures in Blake's image could represent distinct races of people by the end of the 18th century, when the power of religious ideology was rapidly eroding in the face of Enlightenment, rationality, and liberalism. So let us look at the map of the Atlantic world and quickly trace the peculiar history of the plantation. Now, as long as the plantation remained really in this zone, in the early 1400s, slavery was not defined by race, nor was it hereditary, which is very important. However, as the plantation complex moved westward, it began to change. Note that this is the very same time that Islamic influence in the Iberian Peninsula began to wane. Genoese and Venetian merchants familiar with the plantation model began to transplant it along the islands of West Africa, first to Madeira, then the Canaries, and then Cape Verde. In all of these places, the labor force remained multicolored until finally, at around 1520, it reached this tiny island of Sao Tome. It's here for the first time in history that groups of men from Europe commanded a colony and an enslaved labor force entirely composed of Africans alone. From Sao Tome, Portuguese traders transplanted the racialized plantation to Brazil, and from there, Dutch merchants planted it in the Guianas, and they brought it to Barbados, the English traded it up the Caribbean, and finally to Virginia in the 1660s. Now, almost a century and a half before the plantation reached Virginia, Spanish settlers began to draw on the model and adapt it to Spanish colonialism. Indeed, it was the introduction of this model to the Spanish Caribbean that caused a new ideology of race to emerge, the one that was signified in Blake's reddish American figure. Widespread violence and a rising death toll of Indians on Spanish plantations, called encomiendas, sparked a major religious debate about whether Native Americans could be enslaved or not. Racial discourses were central to these debates. Some, such as Bartholomew Las Casas, argued that Native Americans were in fact humans who possessed the capacity for reason and an immortal soul. Others, such as Governor Oviedo of Santo Domingo, argued that indigenous peoples of America were devoid of reason and morality. Indeed, Oviedo proclaimed that the indigenous inhabitants of Santo Domingo did not even have men's heads, but simply thick skulls that made their, quote, understanding bestial and evilly inclined. Thus, we find some of the core dynamics of modern racial thought emerging, with its fixation on inherent corporeal traits as a cause for inequality. These debates, however, were not about equality in the modern sense that we think of it today. They focus instead on whether or not Native Americans were capable of being part of Spanish colonial society. And this is a really, really important point to understand. These debates rested squarely on theological disputes about who was and who was not capable of entering into the community of Catholics, and conversely, who could and could not be enslaved. In the middle of the 16th century, Iberian monarchs imagined themselves not simply as defenders of the faith, but as agents of a God who wanted souls to be saved by way of baptism into the church. This belief lent itself to a flexible definition of who could and could not be included into the society of God itself, profoundly hierarchical and determined by birth as it was. And ultimately, this is why Spain's King Charles V sided with Las Casas. In 1542, Spain's new laws formally outlawed the enslavement of Native Americans at the hands of Spanish colonists. In doing so, the law stipulated that Native Americans were not less than human, but humans of a lesser kind, a race of people spanning islands and continents. Now, this did not mitigate violence by any means, but it did establish a critical precedent upon which Spanish authorities would define civic inclusion in the empire. Slavery, in turn, would be reserved for Africans and Africans alone. You guys following? Okay. It's a lot. We've got a lot more to go, too. Ultimately, these debates had extremely long-lasting consequences, as they framed disputes that would shape new ideas about the relationship between race and civil status in the Iberian empires. These religious justifications of difference intersected with matters of labor and race in various ways across space and time in Latin America. Ultimately, this interplay would give rise to the Baroque notions of status and racial difference reflected in the famous Costa paintings, which provided authorities in Mexico, for example, a visual guide for how to classify the various taxable classes of Spain's imperial subjects according to invented notions of racial taxonomy. Of course, I've raised the emergent racial taxonomies of 18th century Spanish colonies for a few reasons. First, it is a tendency for people in the United States to map their own racial ideologies across the globe, and as noted earlier, to embrace the notion that their idea of race is a real and timeless truth. Second, it is critical to understand how race and civic status operate through much of Latin America during the colonial period, strangely enough, because we find very similar patterns at work in early Virginia prior to the consolidation of the plantation complex in the 1670s. Between the 1620s and 1670s, Virginia looked much like the Baroque world of many Latin American colonies. Though brought to the colony in small numbers as slaves, many Africans were able to purchase their freedom or gain manumission. Countless others were even able to amass large quantities of land, purchase indentured servant contracts, vote, take men to court, white men to court and win, and of course, fight along. The social
Africans, poor European settlers, and upstart farmers burnt Jamestown to the ground, driving the governor out of the fledgling colony's ramshackle capital. While Virginia's elites had already begun to roll back on the civil protections of the colony's black landed families, Bacon's rebellion signaled to them that a largely landless class of colonists was a threat to the hierarchical order of the colonial regime. Within 15 years, Virginia's General Assembly would pass laws forbidding interracial marriage, sex, and leisure, denied voting rights to landed black men, and outlawed violence committed by blacks against Christians. Indeed, much of these laws codified a strict line between the previously blurry distinctions of Indian, Negro, and Christian as used in the parlance of 17th century Virginia. Much like this pamphlet on screen, colonial Virginia, and with it most of the United States, would take on a very binary view about the relationship between race and freedom. I could go on about what Peter Wood famously called the terrible transformation of colonial North America, and this indeed is a subject worthy of a long lecture in and of itself. What is crucial to understand is that unlike in the Catholic empires of Spain and Portugal, the Protestant empires by and large denied civil protections to enslaved Indians and Africans. In North America in particular, where the size of the enslaved community was a minority, this served to white labor undermine the kind of alliances that had given rise to Bacon's. But it also produced a very different kind of racial declaration of independence at some point. I hope, I think, I don't know, maybe. But it's often the case when Americans think about the relationship between hereditary racial slavery and the creation of the United States, people turn to a simple explanation of it's just the way it was, right? But such a simplistic formulation completely denies how the radical potential of the Enlightenment, as ushered forth in the American and French revolutions, actually demanded a completely new kind of racial ideology. Though largely nationalist in aims, the American Revolution was informed by the growing Atlantic turn against hereditary status and toward birthright equality. Just like the notion of aristocratic privilege, slavery too was grounded fundamentally in the notion that one's status was fixed at birth. In short, what we see is thinkers like Jefferson struggling to reconcile these tensions. What emerges in turn is a new ideology about race that appropriates scientific language and hence its secular rationality to reconcile the problem of black freedom, that black freedom supposedly posed this completely new idea of citizenship and the social contract. Thus, we find Jefferson in his famous Notes on the State of Virginia focused squarely on justifying the inherent inequality of the black race. Gone are concerns about redeemable souls or benevolent monarchs. Instead, we see an American slave owner inspired by the rising tide of Atlantic liberalism, denying universal equality at the same time that he proclaims it. The mixture of black and white freedom was deemed a threat to republicanism itself because of the inherent endowments of body and mind. So make no mistake about it, the construction of racial ideology has been at the heart of the Enlightenment ideas, about equality since the notion itself became central to the identity of nationhood.
And this theme is so brilliantly captured in his portrait of the former African slave turned free French citizen, Jean-Baptiste Billet. Now, I'd love to talk more about this image later, but for now, I have to move on. Focusing on modern racism requires us to consider, with deep analytical work, the very ways in which we understand the seemingly obvious term equality, for the term itself bears a profound historical weight. Much like the world of 16th century Spain, the terms of inclusion used to define society dictated the meaning of equality itself in the 19th century United States. Now, I've decided to call Act 2 civilization because when we look at the changing nature of racism and its relationship to inequality, both social reformers and reactionaries turn to the rhetoric of civilization to remake racial hierarchy as the slave system in the United States was eradicated. Now, there are many ways to think about the 19th century United States. Most Americans think of the Civil War, or what many historians now call the Second American Revolution. Now, the abolition of slavery was, without a doubt, a revolutionary moment in American history. Completely undid an entire way of life predicated fundamentally on the racialized plantation regime. What this meant in turn was the nation itself had to be remade. So just a few really important facts. Between 1619 and 1808, roughly 400,000 Africans were sold to the region that became the United States. This was only 4% of the entire Atlantic slave trade. But by 1860, the United States had, by far, the largest enslaved population in the history of the world. Nearly 4 million people were enslaved, roughly 85% of all people of African descent living in the United States. In sheer economic terms, by 1836, nearly 50% of U.S. economic activity was attributable to cotton, which was produced by enslaved people. By 1850, enslaved blacks accounted for 1/5 of all wealth in the United States. By 1860, more millionaires lived per capita in the Mississippi Valley than anywhere else in the United States. So what do all these stats reveal? If it was an independent nation, the South would have been the 4th richest nation in the world in 1860. So make no mistake about it. The Civil War was a revolution. It was a bloody, bloody revolution. It marked a complete upending of a centuries-long way of life whose origin stretched all the way back to Sao Tome. So think about this fact for a minute. How many of you have seen the film Lincoln? How many of you guys saw this film? Okay, so what is the core of that film about? Anybody? Hopefully. Okay. Huh? It's about the passage of the 13th Amendment, which eradicated slavery. Okay? So, quiz. I'm thinking we don't know the answer to this, but what was the final vote count in the House on January 31st, 1865, that ultimately enabled the amendment to move forward for ratification? In other words, the vote count that enabled slavery to be eradicated in the United States by constitutional amendment. What was the vote count? There you go. 3 votes, 2 or 3, depending on how you do the math, right? So you need 2/3 votes to pass the amendment. So let that sink in for a minute. 2 people, maybe 3, counting that little sliver of a percentage, passed the abolition of slavery into the Constitution. What I want us to think about here in Act 2 is perhaps best represented in these before and after pictures of Hubbard Pryor. These pictures tell 2 interwoven stories in my view, and I think they'll help us wrap our heads around why I'm calling the second act civilization. So for those of you unfamiliar with Hubbard Pryor, he was born in to run away to Tennessee in hopes of joining the Union lines
As you can see from this image, when Pryor arrived, he was wearing so-called Negro clothes, slave clothes, the rags that he had on his back when he fled the Georgia plantation. reached Union lines, he received not simply new clothes, but the clothes of a soldier and of a man. And here on the right we see Pryor in France with the side. Just to imagine for a minute what this must have meant. Where Frank and rebel ass, right? So now imagine what this image might have meant to his former owner, whose entire sense of self was measured against that Hubbard on the left, the person whose very manhood he denied existed. Hence we see here one side of what this image captures, what the Civil War meant to Hubbard Pryor and millions like him who wanted to abolish slavery once and for all. But we have to dig a little deeper here, okay? We have to ask ourselves why, ultimately, the photographer created this dyadic portrait. Not only does this image capture Pryor's spirit, but it also tells us about the ways supporters of the Union were making their case for the inclusion of African Americans into the new nation. The purpose of this image was to show officials in Washington and Unionists in the North that black people could, if granted the opportunity, move from the barbarism of slavery to upstanding civilization, marked here in the image of manhood. Both pro-slavery Southerners and racist Northerners had long insisted that black people were inherently incapable, civilized, incapable of participating. Understood in terms of civilization. Who, after all, were the arbiters of what did and did not mark civilization? By and large, this was not simply white people, but middle-class, pious, and importantly, Protestant men and women. Civilization, in the eyes of the vast majority of Northern reformers, was hence wrapped up in notions of sobriety, property ownership, individual responsibility, proper comportment, strict boundaries between male and female gender roles, sexuality, and proper religious practice, just to name a few. So what we know, scholars of slavery know, is that nearly all of these norms actually ran counter to the very communal practices that had enabled enslaved women, men, and children to survive the incredible violence of the slave regime. So in other words, civilization was not a neutral term, nor a race-free way of reorganizing society.
I'm gonna stop right here, ladies and gentlemen. It's a good one. It's a long one, but as you see, share such.
Of white, which remains one of the most durable truths of white. So that would trigger the lynching just by the black, hypersexuality, his sexuality towards a white female. How many the play an estimate the tablet anyone to 1916 4,743 people were lynched by U.S. mobs.
And it's according to Tuskegee numbers, 3,446, nearly 3/4 of those were lynched were African Americans. Wow. This was a lynching. This is what they would do. This is American history right here. It's part of American history. It's at the Capitol. Where did most lynchings take place? They had it in Mississippi, Florida, Arkansas, and Louisiana. Had the highest. Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana had the highest number of lynchings. Who tended the lynchings? White Americans embraced it and come to since they maintain order and enjoyment of wholesome celebration. They will celebrate this. In the 1930s, men joke loudly about the sight of a bleeding body. Girls giggle at the flies feed off the blood that dripped from a Negro's nose. This is America's ugly past. And he reports that Knuckles, victim of the play, at the store. In 1931, Maryview, Missouri lynching of Raymond Gunn, the crowd estimated 2,000 to 4,000 was last quarter women, including hundreds of children. One woman held the little girl, and she could get a better view of the naked Negro blazing on the roof. 1931. Wow. Goes on. You see. Ancient spirit. That's why America can't get over racism. Because it's an ancient spirit. And God is the only one that can put it to rest. 1921, the article about the Tulsa, Oklahoma. There were lynchings. There were lynchings during that time. There were lynchings. Were people punished for carrying out lynching? The vast majority of lynchings were never, whoever anticipated, never was punished. Of approval of law enforcement. If white lynchers were tried and convicted, it was either arson, rioting, or some other much a minor offense. You see. So here it is. Plain as Jane. Plain as Jane. But that's just one that this is off the Guardian. They can't hide this one. This is actually a website. Let's go back. Now we're going the history of the United States. This is the history of it. This is the site I tried to get up earlier. Segregation in the United States. You see. How was the segregation?
Hi,
Well,
I'm Yahuwah Williams. I'm a historian, and here's what you need to know in order to sound smart about Plessy versus Ferguson. The Plessy versus Ferguson case originated with Louisiana's infamous Separate Car Act of 1890. The Separate Car Act required African Americans and whites to sit in segregated compartments of public carriers in Louisiana.
With that freedom,
People at the time of the Plessy decision actually believed that it was possible to measure
Cannot
the
overstate
amount
the
of black
importance
blood
of
a
the fact
person had in
that
their
the
body.
United
The
States
plaintiff
rid
in the
itself of
Plessy
slavery,
Homer
even though
Adolph
it took
Plessy
4
was
bloody
actually
years to
described
do
as
that.
7/8 white.
And that
Homer Plessy was
transformed
arrested
the
after
social
he refused to
face
give up
of
his
the South
seat
and
in
made it
defiance
possible
of the
for
Separate
the
Car Act.
people who
Plessy versus
had
Ferguson
been
is
slaves or whose
considered
ancestors had
important
been slaves
because it
greater
established the
freedom
doctrine
to
of
move
separate but
and to
equal
organize
that allowed
and to begin
states
to
for the
improve
first
their
time
conditions
to segregate the races. One of the reasons that Homer Plessy brought suit
Before the war,
was
there was
because
no
of the
freedom.
difficulty
After the war,
in enforcing segregation in states like
The
Louisiana.
definition of race
Louisiana
relations
had a
in the United
large
States,
mixed
the
race
definition of what
population, making
equal
it
rights
very
and equal
difficult to
opportunities for all
determine
people means
where
has been
the
a work in
line
progress.
was drawn in terms of separating the races. The doctrine of separate but equal that grew out of Plessy versus Ferguson became the standard for all segregation ordinances after that decision. Despite the Supreme Court's ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, the first municipality, city, passed a residential segregation ordinance was Baltimore, Maryland.
That's what we should be celebrating.
The Supreme Court's landmark ruling in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 ultimately was the death knell for the doctrine of separate but equal established in Plessy versus Ferguson.
you see. Is there more? Yes. The residential areas, public parks, to theaters, the pool.
We have this University, Nashville, Tennessee, will create the Compensate Virginia's Institute, established in 1869 as a young school for black youth, but with white instructors teaching skills to relegate black people in service positions to whites. That's the only way they can work as long as they service to whites. The Supreme Court on segregation. In 1875, the outgoing Republican-controlled House passed a Civil Rights Bill outlining discrimination in schools, churches, public transportation, but it was barely enforced and was overturned by the Supreme in 1883. Wow. In 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, that segregation was constitutional. The ruling established the idea of separate but equal. The case of a mixed race man was forced to sit in the black designated train under Louisiana Separate Car Act. So even if you were mixed in 18, a mixture of people, you were segregated. As a part of the segregation movement, some cities instituted zoning laws prohibit black families from moving to white dominant blocks. In 1917, as part of the Buchanan versus Warley, the Supreme Court found such zoning laws to be unconstitutional because it interfered with property rights of owners. And it goes on and on and on. From the greatest migration segregation in the during the Great Migration. During the Great Migration, a period between 1916 and 1970, 6 million African Americans left the South. Huge numbers moved northeast, and reportedly discrimination and segregation similar to what they experienced in the South. So they experienced this up north. The same thing experienced in the South. In the
In the late 1940s, it was still possible to find white-only signs in businesses in the North. Segregated schools, neighborhoods existed. Even after World War II, black activists reported hostile reactions with black people attempting to move to white neighborhoods. The Jim Crow decline. The segregation of Public Works Administration. Redlining in 1930s, like home loan banks like this. See, it goes to show you, ladies and gentlemen, I wasn't just spouting off in my previous videos about the 5 things. This backs up what I'm saying. Housing segregation. Segregation in schools. Busing. Boston busing. Now we come to segregation in the 21st century.
Quick question for you, Malcolm. What do you, me, Shakespeare, and Alanis Morissette all have in common?
We're all inaudible.
That's right. Bonus question. What else do we have in common?
None of us are common.
Malcolm's on fire.
Audiobooks, podcasts, Audible originals, all in one place.
Sorry about the commercial.
Separate but equal.
But there you have it. There you have it. There you have it. There you have it. It hasn't changed. Skin color has not changed. So when people say it's not better now than it was ever, no. It's a repeat. It repeats itself over and over and over. And now, and it was back in the early time. Let's get this also. It was having nothing to do with religion. If you were black, they didn't pull you over because you were Catholic or you were Baptist or you were Presbyterian. They didn't care about that. They didn't care about if you were homosexual, transgender, or anything between. They didn't care about that. You were black, male, female. Some people get lynched. Some people get, discriminated against. They didn't care about that. They cared about was the skin, not the sexuality, not the disability, not your religion. If you were black, an American, you could have been a black person from an immigrant from the Caribbean. You would have been up under the same thing. If you were from Africa, if you was from the West Indies, I'm talking about Bahamas, I'm talking about Jamaica. You could have been from Puerto Rico. Any of those places, if you were dark complected, black, Negro looking features, you got discriminated against in America. In America, discriminated against you. And the spirit of it never left America. This is what people don't understand. It never left. What it does, it weans itself into the 21st century. Now other people that have come in on the backs of these people, of our ancestors, using sexuality, using immigrant rights, using this thing, and it was the American blacks that took the most horrendous blunt. One of the racial groups, they were Native American Indians. There was an incident maybe with Mexican Americans once in a while. And I think Japanese had some things on the coast, and they said there was a few things but African Americans, blacks, from you've seen it. You've seen it from 1400 till all these centuries later, all because of this. And the only way it will end is the Most High. Other than that, because even people who say that they're Christians, I made a video about that. There were Ku Klux Klan people that were Christians. There were some that were Baptists. There were some they were white. There are still today that are churches that are predominantly white throughout this country, not just the South, but throughout this country. They're still all black and all white. Yes, it never left. It never left. But I'm just going to stop this video. But I'm going to. My next is going to show you. I'm going to do a religious study behind this video, and I'm going to show you the complexion of the Most High. All right. Y'all take it easy and be blessed. Take care out there. If I can get this thing there. Okay, we're gonna go to the next one.